Good morning. I'm Joel Kline. I'm a retired Church of the Brethren pastor from Fort Wayne. And when I got up this morning, it was snowing really quite hard in Fort Wayne, and all the streets were ice covered. So I thought this is going to be a long trip. As soon as I got out of town, it cleared up, and the roads were clear coming over here. So that was good. I am told that our pianist is Jeanette Lehman and our tech person is Dennis Metzger. We thank you for your service. I went to read from the book of Jeremiah, chapter 23, verses 1 through 6. Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep in my pasture, declares Yahweh. Thus says Yahweh, the God of Israel, concerning those shepherds who are tending my people. You have scattered my flock and driven them away. You have not attended to them. Behold, I am about to attend to you for the evil of your deeds, declares Yahweh. Then I myself will gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have dispersed them, and will bring them back to their own pasture, and they will be fruitful and multiply. I will also raise up shepherds who will look after them and pasture them. They will no longer be afraid or terrified, nor will they be missing, declares Yahweh. Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will raise up for the house of David a righteous branch, who will reign as a true ruler and act wisely, and do what is just and right in the land. In those days, Judah will be saved and Israel will dwell securely. This is the name on which they will call Yahweh, our justice. I think I was in high school when I first encountered the opening words of Charles Dickens' epic novel, A Tale of Two Cities. If you know English literature, you're probably familiar with those words. He was describing the tumultuous days of the 18th century, marked by political turmoil and deep disparity between rich and poor. Wrote Dickens, it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us. We had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven. We were all going direct the other way. In our age, we like to assume that we've made a great deal of progress, that we have moved towards ever higher levels of enlightenment. And yet, couldn't these words of Dickens describe our age as well? The best of times stand side by side with the worst of times. Wisdom and foolishness too often share the spotlight. We're surrounded by both light and darkness, hope and despair. And if you're anything like me, there are times when it is easy to lose sight of the light and instead place focus upon the foolishness, the darkness, and the despair. To believe that rather than going directly to heaven, we are indeed headed in the opposite direction. In our day, civil and political discourse is anything but civil. And it's often still directed these days by a former leader who will not admit defeat and whose words and actions include hatred and incite hatred and discord, fear, and chaos. Our economy too often ignores the poor and those who subsist at the margins while protecting the wealth and interests of the rich and powerful. Justice and peace remain lovely ideals for many people, but too few are willing to challenge our world's obsession with military might and power over others. All too few invest themselves in God's business of doing justice, loving compassionately, and embracing the hard work of peacemaking. This struggle between hope and despair, light and darkness, wisdom and foolishness is not merely a symptom of Dickens' age or of ours. Indeed, centuries before Jesus, Hebrew prophets labeled the religious and political leaders of their day as false shepherds. In our text that I read just a few moments ago, Jeremiah writes, "Woe to the shepherds who are destroying and scattering the sheep in my pasture. You have scattered my flock and driven them away. You have not attended to them. Behold, I am now attending to you for the evil of your deeds, declares Yahweh." The context for these harsh words lay in the days before the fall of Jerusalem and Israel's forced exile in Babylon. It was a time when those ancient Israelites had lost their way, and their leaders had chosen to rule with an iron fist of oppressive control rather than God's ways of compassionate justice and generous service. And yet, and this is an important yet, a critical yet, those prophets who felt compelled to speak dire words of judgment, nevertheless recognized that judgment never is God's final word. And so the same prophets who rail against unjust leaders now also offer their voices, suggesting that there is a way forward. And that way is to trust in a God whose passion, a God whose very nature centers on healing and wholeness, forgiveness and peace, compassion and justice. Those prophets who spoke judgment against oppressive leaders went on to proclaim new possibilities, to proclaim good news, the good news that ours is a God who is able to overcome the failures of flawed human leaders. Those prophets would have affirmed the words of Richard Rohr, a Catholic priest who writes in a daily meditation from the Center for Action and Contemplation these words: "People who know God well, mystics, hermits, those who risk everything to find God, always meet a lover, not a dictator." It's a reminder that ours is a God of unending grace. Ours is a God of unimaginable love. And ours is a God ever anticipating and creating new life. Indeed, God is so invested in loving and caring for creation that even when all appearances would suggest otherwise, God is at work, often beneath the surface, redeeming and transforming life as we know it. There are many, we know them, many in our own age who are every bit as convinced as were many in Jeremiah's day that God is a God, an angry, a vindictive, a judgmental, a destroying God. They miss this key aspect of the gospel, which is this message of incredible grace. They get caught in the judgment and the anger. And that message, of course, is in the scriptures. But they forget to move beyond that and to see that there is a way forward. That the scriptures again and again remind us of a love that is grounded in our God, a God of abundant compassion, overflowing mercy, and gracious hope. You may know of Dorothy Day, a committed pacifist writer and editor, founder of the Catholic movement back in the 1930s, who was so deeply committed to social justice and caring for the poor and the marginalized. And in those days leading up to World War II, she once wrote, "Whenever I groan within myself and think how hard it is to keep writing about love in these times of tension and strife, which may at any moment become for all of us a time of terror, I think to myself, what else is the world interested in? What else do we want, each of us, except to love and to be loved in our families, in our work, in all our relationships? God is love." Dorothy Day's trust in God's renewing and empowering love is what kept her going. It was her yet, or her nevertheless, that kept her from life mired in tension and fear and despair. Much like the ancient prophets of old, Dorothy Day was compelled to live and proclaim a love that is not merely sentimental, but much more a love that is dynamic, a love that's demanding and redeeming, a revolutionary love that calls us to envision new possibilities that even yet are able to transform terror into promise, despair into hope, darkness into light, foolishness into wisdom. It's the very kind of love that enabled Jeremiah the prophet to visualize that the same God who was ready to pour disdain upon harsh and oppressive leaders did not allow that disdain to be the final word. But instead, God offers something radically new. And our text from Jeremiah 23 goes on to assert that God intends to gather the remnant of my flock out of all the countries where I have dispersed them and bringing them back to their own pasture, and they will be fruitful and multiply, and I will raise up new shepherds who look after them and pasture them, so that the people will no longer be afraid or terrified. Even more, Jeremiah envisions a singular leader in God's image, crying out to the people, "Behold, the days are coming, declares Yahweh, when I will raise up for the house of David a righteous branch who will act as a true ruler and act wisely, doing what is just and right in the land." For those ancient Israelites caught in the dark days of exile, it was a promise of new hope and new beginnings and new creation. And centuries after those words were spoken, followers of Jesus would see them as pointing to Jesus and that realm of life that he opens before them. A realm of life, as Brian McLaren writes in a book entitled A Generous Orthodoxy. Life not of oppressive control, but of dreamed of freedom, not of coercive dominance, but of liberating love, not of domination, but of bottom-up service, not a clenched fist, but of open, wounded hands, extended in a welcoming embrace of kindness, gentleness, forgiveness, and grace. I recently read a novel entitled, entitled The Forest of Vanishing Stars. It's by Kristen Harmel, and it tells the story of frightened Jewish refugees living deep in the forests of Poland, hiding from the Nazi terror in the days of World War II. Yona, the main character, has been raised in that forest by an old woman who had mysteriously abducted her at an early age from her German family. Yona is now living on her own, but she begins to take note of increasing numbers of refugees in that forest. And though she had been taught to be wary of all strangers, she takes the risk of helping a number of those Jewish refugees to learn what it means to survive in the forest. It's a dangerous mission, and she knows little of her origin. She questions her own identity, but there's a scene in which she finds herself alone with Zeus, one of those refugees. A number of their group had been found by the refugees, by the Nazis, and killed. And Zeus is lamenting, every time a good soul dies, I think the world gets a little darker. Yona responded, then it is indeed very dark now. And then Zeus counters, yes, but there is also light. In the times of greatest, greatest darkness, the light always shines through because there are people who stand up to do brave, decent things. What I am trying to say, Yona, is that in moments like these, it doesn't matter just who you were born to be, it matters what you choose to become. So, what say you, my friends? We too live in times of uncertainty, but the question before us is, will we choose to become people of light and wisdom and hope? Will we embrace this God who takes us beyond anger and judgment and fear to a love that knows no limits, a love that emboldens us to proclaim peace, work for justice, confront darkness, and embody light? May it be so. Amen. Our hymn is number 483, O God who gives us life, 483. The hymn writer prays, refresh us with the living spring of hope that never dies. Let us go with that prayer on our lips and in our hearts as we yearn for purposeful living, a never dying hope, and a revolutionary love that enables us to see new possibilities, transforming terror into promise, darkness into light, and foolishness into wisdom. Let us go forth in courage and in peace. Amen.